There is a kind of trust that photographs well, and there's a kind of trust that doesn't photograph at all. The Boeing 707 photographed beautifully. Pan American, New York to Paris, the jet age announced to the world with all the ceremony the world's most famous airline could arrange. Everybody was watching. Everybody was celebrating. The 707 was the future, and it looked exactly like the future was supposed to look. The DC-8 was doing something else. It was earning the kind of trust that doesn't make the front page, the kind that builds in logbooks and maintenance records, and the quiet professional testimony of pilots who flew it for 20 years and mechanics who kept it airborne across 3 decades and never had to apologize for either. The 707 was celebrated. The DC-8 was trusted. Ask the people who actually flew them which one they'd rather be in when things got difficult. Then listen to the pause before they answer.
To understand why the DC-8 felt more serious than the 707, you have to understand the companies that built them, because the aircraft that each company produced reflected in almost every engineering and commercial decision the culture and history of the organization behind it. Boeing in the mid-1950s was primarily a military company. Its commercial reputation rested on the Stratocruiser, a capable aircraft that airlines operated with professional competence but never loved, and its real credibility was in military contracts. The B-47 and B-52 strategic bombers had made Boeing the dominant force in American air power, and the swept-wing jet technology those aircraft represented was exactly what commercial aviation was going to need for the next generation of passenger transport. Boeing knew this. They built the prototype that would become the 707 largely at their own expense, a gamble of historic proportions made by a company that understood military procurement timelines and decided to apply that same long-view thinking to the commercial market. The result was an aircraft designed by engineers whose deepest experience was in military performance, in making aircraft go fast, go high, and go far. The 707 was brilliant at all of those things. It was also, in certain respects, an aircraft that its designers had approached with the assumptions of a military program. Assumptions about what operators could handle, what maintenance organizations could support, and what the relationship between manufacturer and airline customer looked like in practice. Douglas came from somewhere completely different. 30 years of building commercial aircraft, 30 years of the specific, demanding, often humbling education that comes from having your product operated by airline maintenance departments, flown by airline pilots, and depended on by airline passengers day after day on schedules that had no tolerance for the kind of problems that military operations could sometimes absorb. The DC-3 had taught Douglas what commercial aviation needed. The DC-4, DC-6, and DC-7 had refined that education across 20 years of operational feedback that shaped how Douglas engineers thought about every design decision they made. When Douglas committed to the DC-8, they brought all of that accumulated understanding to the project. They weren't building the fastest possible jet transport or the most aerodynamically elegant one. They were building the most commercially sustainable one. The aircraft that airlines could operate profitably, that maintenance organizations could support efficiently, that pilots could fly safely through decades of service, and that passengers could depend on with the particular confidence that comes from an airline industry genuinely backing what it operates. The DC-8 arrived a year after the 707. In the currency of headlines and market perception, that year was significant. In the currency of the professional aviation community, the pilots, the mechanics, the airline operations managers who would live with the aircraft for decades, what mattered was not who arrived first, but what they brought when they arrived. What Douglas brought was 30 years of knowing what commercial aviation actually needed, and the DC-8 showed it in every panel, every system, every design choice that revealed itself not in the first flight, but in the 10,000th. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The DC-8's seriousness was not a single thing. It was an accumulation, a collection of decisions, large and small, that added up to an aircraft which professionals experience as fundamentally honest, as built by people who had thought carefully about what it would mean to depend on this machine for a living and had designed accordingly. Start with the cockpit.
The instrument layout of the DC-8 reflected Douglas's long experience of working with airline crews, not just in consulting them during design, but in the specific operational way of a company that had been receiving feedback from professional aviators for 30 years and had learned to take it seriously. The DC-8's flight deck was organized with a logic that experienced pilots found immediately legible. Not necessarily simpler than the 707s, the aircraft were comparable in systems complexity, but laid out with an intentionality that suggested the designers had asked specifically and repeatedly what a pilot needed to find quickly when things were not going well. The answer to that question was visible in the arrangement of the instruments and systems controls in a way that pilots noticed and appreciated even if they couldn't always articulate exactly why. The system's architecture throughout the aircraft reflected the same philosophy. Hydraulic, electrical, and pneumatic systems were organized with a clarity that experienced flight engineers found genuinely satisfying to learn. The kind of logical structure that rewards complete understanding rather than confronting the experienced operator with arbitrary complexity. One veteran DC-8 flight engineer described learning the aircraft's systems as acquiring a second language that turned out to be more internally consistent than the first. Once you understood the DC-8's logic, he said, the aircraft stops surprising you. And an aircraft that stops surprising you is an aircraft you can trust. The structural design deserves particular attention because it is where Douglas's commercial philosophy showed itself most clearly. The DC-8 was built with margins that reflected Douglas's understanding of what airline operation actually did to airframes over time. Not the pristine conditions of a flight test program, but the accumulated stress of daily schedules, varied loads, imperfect runways, and the thousand small compromises that operational reality imposes on any aircraft that earns its living flying. The DC-8 structure was honest about those stresses, designed to absorb them gracefully rather than to perform beautifully in optimal conditions and reveal its limits when conditions deteriorated. The fuselage cross-section was another area where Douglas's foresight showed itself, not immediately but over time. The DC-8's fuselage was designed from the beginning with extension in mind. The structural architecture anticipated a longer aircraft, and when the stretch Super 60 series arrived in the mid-1960s, the extension was accomplished without a fundamental redesign that a less far-sighted original design would have required. The Super 61, with its fuselage stretched by nearly 40 feet, became the highest-capacity single-aisle aircraft of its era. The economics were compelling, the engineering was clean, and both of those things were possible because Douglas had designed for the future that they anticipated rather than merely for the present they occupied. The maintenance access throughout the DC-8 was the thing that mechanics talked about with the most direct and personal appreciation. Panels that came off cleanly, systems accessible without disassembling adjacent structure, an overall maintenance philosophy that reflected the understanding, rare in aircraft design and never fully achievable but clearly present in the DC-8, that the people who would keep this aircraft airworthy deserved consideration in the design process. One veteran DC-8 mechanic who spent 20 years on the type described it as the only aircraft he ever worked on where he consistently felt that whoever had designed the maintenance access had actually thought about what it would be like to perform maintenance. That feeling, he said, made him better at his job, made him trust the aircraft more completely, made him sign off releases with a confidence that was specific rather than merely procedural. And then there was the speed footnote, the DC-8's brief, deliberate, extraordinary moment as the fastest commercial aircraft in the world. In 1961, a DC-8 test crew took the aircraft into a controlled dive and exceeded the speed of sound, reaching Mach 1.012 before easing back. This was not an accident, it was a test, conducted with engineering precision to gather data about the aircraft's transonic behavior. The aircraft came through without structural damage. For the DC-8's engineers, it was confirmation of the margins they had built in. For the pilots who knew about it, it was a specific and quantifiable statement about what the DC-8 was made of. An aircraft that could be taken supersonic without coming apart had been built with honesty about its own structural reality, and that honesty was visible in every other aspect of the design if you knew how to look for it.
The human experience of the DCA has a specific texture that you recognize once you've encountered it, a quality of professional affection that is different from enthusiasm and different from nostalgia and closer to what you feel about a colleague who never let you down. Pilots who flew the DC-8 as their primary type, and there were many across many carriers and many decades, describe the aircraft with a consistency that suggests they are describing something real rather than constructing a shared story. The word that appears most frequently in different forms and different contexts is honest. The DC-8 was honest. It told you what it was doing. It told you what it was about to do. And if you were paying attention, which it made you want to pay attention, it rarely told you anything you weren't prepared to hear. That quality of honesty had a specific value in the moments that mattered most. Commercial aviation's most demanding situations are not the routine ones. They are the edge cases, the deteriorating weather approaches, the system failures at inconvenient moments, the situations where the aircraft's behavior in conditions slightly outside the normal envelope become suddenly urgently relevant. Pilots who flew the DC-8 describe an aircraft that behaved consistently at those edges, that didn't produce unexpected characteristics when conditions pushed it toward the limits of what it had been asked to do. The aircraft that surprised you least in normal operations, they found, surprised you least in abnormal ones too. The DC-8's honesty was not situational, it was structural. The captains who flew the DC-8 on long international routes, the trans-Pacific sectors for Japan Airlines, and the transatlantic runs for Alitalia and Swissair, and the long domestic trunk routes for United, describe the aircraft with a particular appreciation for what it gave them on the far end of a 10-hour sector. Fatigue is a real factor in long-haul aviation, and the aircraft that a pilot is operating at the end of a long flight is in some ways a different aircraft than the one he boarded fresh. The DC-8, in the testimony of long-haul veterans, held its character across those hours. It was the same aircraft to land after 10 hours as it was to take off at the beginning. That consistency, that refusal to become harder to manage as the flight wore on, was something pilots valued enormously and talked about with the specific gratitude of people who had experienced what its absence felt like. The flight engineers developed a relationship with the DC-8 systems that several describe as the deepest professional knowledge they ever acquired. The DC-8 systems were complex, necessarily for an aircraft of its capabilities, but they were complex in the way that a sophisticated but logical system is complex, rather than in the way that an arbitrarily complicated system is complex. The difference is enormous in practice. A logical system can be understood completely, and complete understanding produces a kind of confidence that partial understanding never achieves. DC-8's flight engineers who had accumulated that complete understanding described being able to diagnose developing problems by sound and feel before the instruments confirmed them, a level of intimacy with a machine that only comes from years of genuine engagement, and an aircraft willing to be fully known. The passengers who flew on DC-8s have the most common and most revealing experience of all. They don't remember it, not because it was forgettable in any negative sense, but because it did its job so completely and so quietly that there was nothing about it that demanded to be remembered. They arrived. That was the whole experience, which is, if you think about it, exactly what an airline aircraft is supposed to provide, and the highest possible compliment you can pay to an aircraft that never sought the spotlight.
The DC-8's conflicts was structural and persistent and had very little to do with the aircraft's quality, which is in its own way the most frustrating kind of conflict to navigate. Boeing's head start with the 707 produced market advantages that compounded over time. Airlines that had built their training programs, their maintenance organizations, and their spare parts inventories around the 707 had powerful financial reasons to stay with Boeing for subsequent purchases. The switching cost was real and significant, and it operated as a gravitational force that pulled fleet decisions toward Boeing regardless of what the DC-8's operating economics suggested in isolation. Pan American's decision to order the 707 first and to make that order the defining commercial event of the jet age's introduction gave Boeing a reputational advantage that no subsequent demonstration of DC-8 quality could fully overcome in the public mind. The 707 was the aircraft that started the jet age. That narrative, once established, proved remarkably resistant to revision. The DC-8 was the aircraft that was also there, also excellent, also serving millions of passengers with complete reliability, but that had arrived into a story already written around its competitor. The DC-10 accidents of the early 1970s, while involving a different aircraft entirely, cast a shadow on the McDonnell Douglas name that affected the DC-8's commercial standing in ways that were unfair to an aircraft that had nothing to do with the DC-10's early problems. Perception in commercial aviation, as in most industries, doesn't always track with technical reality. And yet, the DC-8 survived all of it. The stretch variants found a market. The re-engined freighter conversions found another market. The aircraft's fundamental quality proved durable enough to outlast the competitive disadvantages that surrounded it, which is, perhaps, the most compelling argument for what Douglas had built.
The DC-8's legacy is the legacy of professional trust, the kind that doesn't generate museums or movies, but that shows up in the specific personal testimony of the people who depended on it. It flew commercially for over 40 years in passenger configuration, and longer still in freight service. It stretched further than anyone predicted. It re-engined itself into the modern era when lesser aircraft had been retired for decades. It earned from the pilots and mechanics and flight engineers who worked with it a quality of professional affection that the 707, for all its historical importance, never quite generated in the same way or to the same depth. The DC-8 demonstrated something important about what commercial aviation actually requires, that the aircraft that earns the deepest professional trust is not necessarily the most celebrated one, and that the qualities that matter most to the people operating the aircraft day after day are not always the qualities that attract attention from the people watching from the outside. Reliability, legibility, honest structural margins, maintenance access designed by people who had thought about maintenance, systems organized by people who had thought about the humans who would manage them. These are not glamorous qualities. They are not qualities that photograph well or generate headlines. They are the qualities that produce over decades of operation the specific kind of trust that the DC-8 earned and that the people who flew and maintained it are still trying to articulate years after the aircraft left their working lives in terms that adequately capture what it felt like to depend on something completely and have it never let you down.
We began with a contrast, the 707 in the flashbulbs, the DC-8 in the quiet of a ramp at dusk being prepared for flight by a pilot who trusted it completely. That contrast is the whole story. The 707 changed aviation. It deserves every word that has been written about it and every photograph taken of it and every place it occupies in the history of the jet age. None of that is wrong. But the DC-8 did something different. It built, flight by flight, and year by year, and decade by decade, a relationship with the professionals who flew and maintained it that was deeper and more personal and more durable than celebrity. It built trust, the specific, earned professional trust that only comes from an aircraft that tells you the truth about itself every time you ask, that behaves at the edges of its envelope the way it behaves in the middle, that ages honestly and maintains accessibly and communicates clearly and never, in the end, surprises you badly. That kind of trust doesn't make the front page. But it makes pilots, when you ask them which aircraft they'd rather be in when things get difficult, pause before they answer, and then say, the DC-8, every time.
By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming.